After Exposure, Asbestos and Mesothelioma Stories, a podcast from the Mesothelioma Center at asbestos.com. On this episode, we discuss the impact of federal funding on cancer research. Your host is Dr. Catherine Perot, Chief Medical Officer with the Mesothelioma Center's Medical Outreach Program.
Thank you for joining us. On this episode, we're discussing a topic that has far-reaching consequences for patients, cancer research funding, and what the recent budget decisions mean for the future of mesothelioma research. Mesothelioma is a rare and aggressive disease affecting about 3,000 patients yearly in the US, and progress depends heavily on sustained disease-specific research. Today, we're going to explore how funding instability affects scientific discovery, clinical trials, and ultimately the care options available to patients. I'm thrilled to introduce you all to Dr. Michele Carbone, an internationally recognized mesothelioma researcher and physician scientist at the University of Hawaii Cancer Center. Dr. Carbone has spent decades studying the environmental and genetic drivers for mesothelioma, and his work has fundamentally shaped how we understand this disease. For years, his research has been continuously funded by the NIH, a reflection both to his scientific rigor and the real-world impact of his work. He has also been widely known for his groundbreaking research of BAP1, a tumor suppressor gene that has helped establish as central to mesothelioma biology, showing that inherited mutations can dramatically increase cancer risk. This discovery has changed how we think about risk, screening, prevention, and long-term outcomes for mesothelioma patients and families. I'm really grateful to have you here with us, Dr. Carbone.
Thank you, Catherine. It's very nice to be here.
So before we get into the details of today's topic, can you kind of give us a little rundown of how closely tied the progress in mesothelioma treatments are to sustained federal research funding?
Funding is key to do progress. So there cannot be any progress if you do not have funding, because you need to be able to buy the reagents to do whatever experiment or test you have to do. You have to be able to pay the salaries of those who work for you. So without funding, there cannot be any research.
I understand. So one thing that's especially, I think, confusing to some people is as of last week, the NIH was fully funded for research. But we know that in early 2025, a lot of cuts happened to research funding. And we've heard from some of our scientific researchers that they say that even 1 year of lapse of funding can have long-term repercussions, especially in the rare cancer field. Can you kind of give us an understanding of why even that short 1 year of cancer funding cuts can have these long-term consequences?
Sure, but I think that there is a general misconception here, and that is that the cancer research was going great and suddenly is not. That is absolutely not true. I started to work, I got my first grant, I think was 2000. So it is 25 years ago I got my first grant from the NIH. And the first R1, actually, the first R1 was $250,000. At that time, I think Clinton was the president, the pay line was 27 percentile, which means that 27% of the grant application were funded. Over time, that percentage has been shrinking. By the time that Obama was president, the percentile of granted fund had shrunk to 9%. So we have gone to 27% to 9%. In the past few years, has been between 8 and 10%. 8% were the past 2 years. And then this year, the National Cancer Institute is funding a 4 percentile. Actually, they just told me they're funding a 2 percentile because they cannot make the 4 percentile. But you see that is a continuous decline in funding, and now we have reached the bottom. The other consideration into this, however, is when you talk about funding. In 2000, an R1 was $250,000. With that, we researchers have to pay everything, have to pay a portion of our salaries because the university wants to recover some salary. And then we have to pay the salary of those who work with us. We have to buy the reagents. We have to pay for everything you can think of. Today, the R1 is $250,000. So $250,000 in 2000 bought about 3 times, or at least 2 times, what you can buy today with $250,000. Moreover, we have developed more technology that is extremely expensive. For example, in the 2000, you would do what is called immunohistochemistry. That is a test in which you test on slides whether some cells are positive or negative for an antibody. That costed about $4 per slide. Today, we use spatial transcriptomics. It costs $20,000 per slide. Now, can you tell me how you think that you can be doing research with $250,000 at the forefront of medical research? It's impossible. So it's very simplistic to say that suddenly cancer research is not funded. No, this has been a progressive thing, and eventually you reach the bottom, which is now there is basically no funding available anymore. But even if you get that funding is not enough to be doing the type of research that we would like to be doing to find ways to cure cancer. Now, in spite of that, we have done significant progress in the research of mesothelioma with the little resources that we have available. For example, you mentioned the BAP1. Now we know that we discovered that people who have germline BAP1 mutations and who develop mesothelioma have a much less aggressive disease that respond to therapy. There has been a lot of discussion in the world of mesothelioma on whether surgery, for example, helps or does not help mesothelioma. The simple fact that people discuss that, it means it doesn't help a lot. Otherwise, you wouldn't discuss it, okay? But we know that we can actually cure patients who have mesothelioma and who can, because they have a BAP1 mutation and they develop mesothelioma on a background of BAP1 mutation, meaning the genetically linked mesothelioma respond very well to therapy. And so now we have identified a group of patients that can respond to this therapy and who can live long and who can die of old age, can be cured. So there has been significant progress in mesothelioma that we have been able to do with the relatively limited resources, which makes me think, imagine what we could do if we actually had the money that we need to work.
I completely agree with you. And so when I hear you talk about like these decreasing funds, is it just for rare cancers, or is this all cancers across the board that are seeing this kind of like pinching and decrease in their budgets?
No, it's across all the cancer in the board. What happened is that as the percentage of grants funded is smaller and the money is smaller, then the study sections, that are the group of scientists that are put together by the NIH and then decide that this grant will be funded, this will not be funded, will inevitably say, well, there are many more lung cancer than mesotheliomas. If we can only give one cancer, one grant, we are going to give it to lung cancer because there are more lung cancer than mesotheliomas. Actually, I think that is wrong, that criteria. And may I explain why?
Of course.
The reason is the following. That if you look at who funds cancer research in the United States of America, if I remember correctly, the NIH has funded an amount of $46 billion a year, medical research, and pharma in the amount of $100 billion. Mm-hmm. And if you put the European community all together, they are less than $10 billion altogether. So basically, the European community is a very small contributor to what is a global fight, okay? This is not an issue of America or an issue of Italy because I'm Italian, or an issue of Guatemala or whatever you want. Cancer hits everybody. every country, every race, every political field you are, the cancer doesn't care. He hits everybody. So it should be the one thing that unites all of us, because we are all together in it. Cancer doesn't make any difference. So whatever progress is made because research is done in a country or in another, it benefits the entire world. So I think we should all work together on it. But who is funding it? Mostly pharma companies that are based in the United States with over $100 billion a year. Below, there is the National Institute of Health, the federal government, and the DoD, the Department of Defense, which together make, I think, $50 billion. And then down there, there is the European Union. And we do not know how much China is funding, but now I think they're funding more than all of us. So going back to the original issue, pharma needs to make money. That's why they exist. So otherwise they wouldn't exist. So they need to make money. And therefore, inevitably, they are going to put almost all, if not all of their resources in the tumors that are the most common malignancies, because that's where they're going to make money. In lung cancer, breast cancer, prostate cancers. These are the cancers that affect most people, and that's where all the money of pharma goes. So in my opinion, the money that the NIH has should go in the rare tumors, because those are not funded by pharma. And altogether, the rare tumors represent 20% of all cancers, which is not a little. And those are not funded by pharma at all. But anyway, it's not this way. And therefore, we are not supported by pharma. We are not supported now. It's almost impossible to get funding through the NIH, because at 2% percentile, it's inevitable that the money will go to breast cancer, prostate cancer, and lung cancer, and things like that. And so it's going to be very, very difficult to do any progress in mesothelioma or other cancers.
This is you're answering a lot of questions that I had for us coming up. And I wanted to kind of clarify, because we talked about these R01 grants. And for people who don't know, who are listening, R01s are kind of like the gold standard of research grants from the NIH. They are just a way to allow researchers to carry out very long-term research projects. And actually, I think I was looking into this, about 60% of new drug developments are linked back to some sort of NIH-funded research. So they're very important at the baseline for the creation of these new pharmaceutical drugs for patients. But we had kind of talked back and forth before, and you brought up an interesting concept, which was that when I looked it up, there's actually only 3 R01 grants that are currently funded by the NIH for 2025 and 2026. So with the number decreasing over the years of these R01 mesothelioma specific funds, like, what are we risking in the future?
Look, it's important to hope that the situation will change, because obviously with 3 R01s that today are $250,000 or maybe a little more sometimes, but which is an amount of money that is insufficient to do research, because an R01 today, if you really wanted to do research, should be 5 times that. $250,000, you can't do anything. So yes, we need to hope that things will change, and that the United States will decide to invest to fight cancer. And because cancer kills 1/3 of people, and therefore is a problem from all of us. And to me, it's very difficult to understand why we invest so little into cancer, and we invest so much more money into things that of course are important. But if you compare how many people die of that, of a terrorist attack, compared to how many people die of cancer, there is no comparison. You're talking about hundreds or maybe 1,000 to millions and millions and millions. So there is a tremendous disproportion that is based on the emotion that certain type of deaths cause versus others that we think that they should happen, when in fact they should not happen. And if we had the resources, we would be able to do a lot for cancer. But anyway, that's the thing. But the fact is, there is the reality. And the reality is, it is what it is. So at this time, there is no way that we are going to be doing research only based on federal funding. So we need, if possible, to get support from pharma. And we need support from the American people, from donations, from companies. The great thing of America that makes America, United States, different than Europe is that in Europe, when we need something, I was born in Italy, when we need something, we expect the government to come and we complain. The thing that I see in America is that Americans take things in their own hands. And if the government is not doing something, then the private sector steps in and gets things done. Well, that's what we need now. We need the private sector.
I definitely agree with you that collaboration is a very important step, especially in like mesothelioma research. But when I'm thinking about like your life as a researcher, saying that like your first R01 was in the 2000, and you started, I think I looked up that your first R01 for asbestos specifically was in 2005. So you've had this very prolonged career path dedicated to asbestos and mesothelioma. With only 3 R01s, are we getting a decrease in the amount of researchers that you're able to also guide and mentor in this? So not only through the funding, but through the lack of exposure of young researchers that are going to be going into this field?
Of course. I mean, I have that most of the people who worked for me in the past years, all of them actually, don't want to do mesothelioma research because they think that I'm the only one who is able to get funding, but it's too difficult for them to get mesothelioma research. So on one end, it's difficult to find people who want to train in a mesothelioma lab because they think then what we do. And then when they leave from here, they want to go into pharma or into other things, but they don't want to continue to do mesothelioma research because there is no funding for it. And therefore they think that it's a very risky from the point of view of a career to do mesothelioma research because there is no money for that. And if you think, it's incredible because mesothelioma moves millions, billions of dollars in litigation every year. I mean, I read somewhere, I could be wrong, but I think I read somewhere that Johnson & Johnson agreed on some type of settlement of $1 billion. $1 billion? You know, how, with that amount of money, most likely we could cure mesothelioma. We have never seen an amount of money like that. How is it possible that all this money moves in litigation from one side to the other and nothing is done to solve the problem?
Yeah. And I mean, as you've made it so well, like understood to us, it is like research is so at the heart of understanding all of this. Can you know, kind of give us the pipeline between like research like yours that is done in a lab and then the clinical trials that kind of move on to patients and the development of drugs for this very specific cancer. What does that kind of look like in amount of time and the requirements for it?
Different people do research in a different way. So what applies to me and my research does not necessarily apply to other people. I've studied only mesothelioma all my life. Many people study different things and they come across mesothelioma. The way that work for me is that I'm a medical doctor, I'm a pathologist, a board-certified pathologist, and I'm a researcher. I started by going into villages in Turkey where there was an epidemic of mesothelioma, and half of the people died of mesothelioma, trying to understand what it was. So I started working in the middle of nowhere in 3 villages in Turkey. And there I concluded that this was a genetic link disease, that people who got mesothelioma belonged to certain families. And so that was passed, as we say, in a Mendelian fashion, which means from one generation to the other, the risk of developing mesothelioma. And they lived in an area where there was this fiber that was similar to asbestos, that is called erionite. And so it was gene-environment interaction, in which people who are predisposed to get cancer got exposed to this. Like people who have very white skin and they go to the sun and they get cancer, okay? The Scandinavian, when they go to the beach, they get melanoma because they are white. Something like that, okay? So then from there, I started studying. American families start calling me and telling me, look, you're going all the way to Turkey, but we have a lot of mesothelioma in our families. Why don't you study us? So I started to study them. And that was what? That was 1997, 98. And then I found a gene that is called BAP1 that was mutated in this family and that predisposed them to mesothelioma. But then I discovered they develop also other cancers. And then I started collecting these families. Collecting meaning people were calling me, and so I started going to meet them or invite them to Hawaii, fly to their surgeries. I'm a pathologist, so I would do the frozen section, read the frozen section, and then with their permission, take the specimen to my lab and study the specimens in the lab to see what was that was causing cancer in them. And that's how we found the BAP1 mutation. But I could do that because I'm a medical doctor. If I didn't have the boards in pathology, I couldn't do that. But I did that.
Yeah,
So
I'll be completely honest. I don't think I've ever heard of a clinical trial where the primary investigator goes to the patient.
no, I was flying to various places and then inviting them to Hawaii and fundraising to get the money to bring them to Hawaii. And here I would do early screening for them and get specimens for them. And that's how we found the gene. And then we found how the gene works, studying their cells. And then their cells were limited. So we got transgenic mice in which we put the same genetic alteration to validate in the mouse how things work. Usually people do the other way around. They do the mouse and then test the human. I instead did the work first in the humans and then tested in the mouse where in fact the thing worked. And then over the years, I collected, maybe is the wrong word, but I enrolled in what was my clinical trial, more than 100 families. And I have now a person in the lab whose job is to maintain contact with all of them because there are a lot. And I know many of them personally very well because I met many times. They come here, I go to their place. And then I found that these people were not dying, which was great because usually when you see a mesothelioma patients, you don't see them patient again next year. Instead, I kept seeing it. And so I published papers saying, look, these people don't die. This mesothelioma is different. And then I started to study why it was different. And the NIH got intrigued by what I was saying. And we got the NIH to open 2 clinical trials for mesothelioma patients with BAP1 mutation, which is incredible because there is no other genetic mutation that has 2 clinical trials at the NIH to study them. And that was fantastic because now I could direct my families, the one that I was studying, to be enrolled into the clinical trial at the NIH, where everything is free. So it was a phenomenal resource for our mesothelioma patients, for all the patients, no matter what cancer they got. As long as they had a BAP1 mutation, they would get enrolled at the NIH, studied for free for early detection, and treated for free.
That's amazing.
And all their family members who had inherited the mutation, all of them are enrolled and treated for free at the NIH. That is one of the best medical centers. So in parallel, the NIH was running their trial and I was running my trial. And we published the result of my trial in November of 2025 in Journal of Thoracic Oncology, saying that this is a different disease that tends to spread superficially and not to invade deeply. And because it's spread on the surface of the pleura and of the peritoneum, rather than going deep into the organs, doesn't kill the patient, and that this patient respond to therapy, and that these tumors histologically have unique characteristics. And at the same time, the NIH first trial, the surgical clinical trial, was concluded and published in the same issue of JTO, confirming 100% our data. So there you see, in response to your question, my clinical trial was very different. The one that the NIH started because of the work that we had done, which intrigued the NIH because we were saying these people don't die. And they say, is it possible? I mean, mesothelioma people die. Let's check it out. And so that's how the clinical trial started. And that's how it went to clinic. Other investigators have different experience. Other people may work in their lab, work with mice and working with cells in tissue culture, find a gene or a drug that works into the mouse, and then they can intrigue a pharmaceutical company and say, look, we found this thing that works in the mouse. Would you test it into the human? And then the pharmaceutical company may decide to invest into that drug and try that in a human. So it's different how things go from what we call basic research to the patient's bed. But without the discovery phase, without the guy who goes in the villages in Turkey, or without the person who in the lab tests the cells or the mice, there is nothing to test. So you have to have a discovery phase that produce something that can be tested. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. Can you kind of give me a rundown? What was the length of time of your discovery phase and then your length of time for the clinical trial before the NIH even kind of picked up on what you were doing?
Oh, I went to Turkey the first time, I think was in November 1997. And when I went there, I saw something terrible because everybody was dying of it. And I felt completely inadequate because people were asking me questions because I was supposed to be the American expert and I had no answer. So everything I knew was useless. Everything I'd studied was useless. I had no idea. I was asking those people why you get cancer. So I went home and I thought, I felt terrible. I said, I want to fix this problem. So I told my chairman, that's what I want to do. I want to go to the village back and study it. It took from 97 to 2001 to publish my first paper that this was a disease that had a genetic cause and was gene-environment interaction. And I said there has to be a gene. And then I proposed to look for the gene. And I asked the NIH $10 million to find the gene. That is the biggest grant that the NIH can give. It's called PO1. Mm-hmm. And when I put together this grant, people told me that I was crazy, that nobody would ever give me $10 million to study an epidemic of cancer in the middle of nowhere, and who could care less of mesothelioma, that was a rare cancer. Well, somehow, the study section gave me the $10 million. Now I had $10 million. And so that is, it took me from 2001 until 2006 to get this $10 million grant. Then we started studying that. And after 4 years and 6 months of failure, complete failures, finally we found the gene. And we published that in 2011. So from finding that this had a genetic underlying cause to find the gene, 10 years, from 2001 to 2011. Yeah. Then it took me another 4 years to publish a paper saying, look, these people don't seem to be dying. They're doing well. What is it? And then I published other papers about that. And in the same time, in 2011, we published that BAP1 was causing this, but nobody knew anything about BAP1. It was a new gene. So why was this gene so powerful, how it worked? So that took until 2017 when we published in Nature how BAP1 worked, and was the only paper ever published in Nature that is the top medical journal in science. There's never been a paper in Nature about mesothelioma. That remains to be the only one. And in 2017, so it took what, from 2011 to 2017 is 6 years to publish how it works. Why, when BAP1 is broken, when it's not working, people develop cancer. And in particular, they get mesothelioma, but they get all type of cancers. And so that is 2017. By that time, by 2018, the NIH published the first paper saying that they had checked, and indeed these people didn't die. And that was by Dr. Rafit Hassan, who is the chief of thoracic oncology there. And he published in 2019, actually, in January 2019, he published a beautiful paper in PNAS saying, yes, actually, these people don't die. Actually, I mean, they die. We all die, of course. So we all die. They do not die within a year, like most patients with mesothelioma.
Right.
And then at that point, he started this clinical trial, and Dr. David Schramp, who is the director of thoracic surgery at the National Cancer Institute, opened a clinical trial for patients with mesothelioma. And he started enrolling patients, and we established a collaboration with Dr. Schramp, and I started directing all my family to Dr. Schramp and to Dr. Rafit Hassan because it's free. I mean, you cannot beat that, and it's one of the best places in the world. So I say, guys, why you have to pay to be treated? It's free. Go to the NIH, and it's the best place where you can go. And also, they can be screened for all other cancers. And that took from 2019, say, to 2025, when we published these two papers in November of 2025, that really changed the way that we look at these patients. And the most important thing, one of the most important things, is that because of the unique nature of this mesothelioma, they almost invariably have mesothelioma in both pleural spaces and in the peritoneum, which led in the past to the wrong diagnosis of stage 4 malignant mesothelioma. So these poor patients were given a prognosis of 6 months to live because they thought they had metastatic mesothelioma all over. They didn't understand, now we do understand, that this is not a metastatic mesothelioma. This is how this mesothelioma presents, but these people, in fact, can live a long life. And they don't need very aggressive therapies. Instead, they were receiving extremely aggressive therapies, thinking that they had few months to live, but it's a completely different disease. So it had a great impact into their life. And the NIH has been fantastic. I mean, these two clinical trials at the NIH have been fantastic. The NIH is a wonderful place. We should put much more resources into the NIH. That's what I think.
I agree with you. So, but if we're looking back, so this from discovery phase to when this was last published in 2025, that's a 28-year like research cycle for you to get to this, like not discovery, but to get to these outcomes. You were funded the entire time through the NIH. Would it have changed anything if you were funded through different resources like pharma or foundations or donations, or the science develops slowly, naturally?
No, the science develops slowly and then quicker when you receive source of funding. So having got $10 million from the NIH to find the gene accelerated the research that was going on from 2001 to 2006 at very slow pace because of a limit. I had the R01 funding at that time, but was R01 funding at a different level than getting $10 million. Now, those $10 million, they give very few of those grants, but the $10 million grant of the NIH obviously allowed me to do very different things. Then after I found the gene, or more or less at that time, I remember, I started getting also donations. And donation helped me a lot because donation allow us to integrate the funding of the NIH that is going down. Is going down not because it was going down the amount of NIH grants that I won, but because the money did not buy the same thing that bought in 2000 by the time that I'm in 2010 and by the time I'm in 2020. So even if you get NIH funding, you need to be able to fundraise to get other source of money. Otherwise, today, only with the NIH funding, it's impossible to be moving further in research because it's not enough. So NIH funding needs to go back to the levels that was 25 years ago, but not just the number, adjusting the number
Right.
to the inflation. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
So your research specifically, it was into the specific like BAP1 for clinical trials, for instance, that are much more treatment related. Like in the advent of immunotherapy, there are so many, like if a quick look at clinicaltrial.gov gives us that there's currently 53 open clinical trials pertaining to mesothelioma. Not necessarily that it's the main focus, but that mesothelioma can be included in. 14 of those are NIH funded. The rest are all funded through various sources. When we're looking at drug development, do those trials tend to be longer, shorter comparatively to what you experience?
It really depends. All of the trials that you mentioned are not designed for mesothelioma. Are trials are drugs that were designed for other diseases. For example, the most known one is immunotherapy. Immunotherapy was designed for other diseases. Then you say, okay, immunotherapy is working in melanoma. Let's check whether it works also in mesothelioma. So you take already a product that was designed for another disease and see whether it works in mesothelioma. Now, the time, how do you consider the time? You cannot consider the time from start to finish of the immunotherapy because that was done for another disease. Then you say, let's try if it works with mesothelioma. Unfortunately, usually these things don't work because they have not been designed for mesothelioma. They've been designed for a disease with different characteristics. And then you try to see, okay, well, let's see in case it works for mesothelioma. So most of these drugs, not all, but most of these drugs are drugs that have been designed for another purpose. And then you do a trial for mesothelioma to see whether it works. That's how many of these, not all, but many of these things have been designed. We now have found that these people don't die for mesothelioma. So now I am trying to convince pharma, I don't know if I will, that if we can figure it out, why is that people who have a germline BAP1 mutation survive mesothelioma, because you see it's a double sword. On one hand, if you're born with a BAP1 mutation, you are going to get cancer, and among the cancer, the most likely one that you develop is mesothelioma. But on the other hand, if you are diagnosed with cancer or with mesothelioma, you wish you had a BAP1 mutation because now you can fight cancer. So there are advantages and disadvantages here. So the idea is that what I'm trying to do, what we are studying now, I'm just coming from a meeting with my collaborators at NYU with whom we are studying this. If we can figure it out, how is that people who have germline BAP1 mutation can fight cancer and keep cancer from invading, then we could be able to help a lot of people and develop specific drugs for mesothelioma. So I'm trying to see if I can convince pharma of that and work with pharma. I've never worked with pharma before, but I am trying to see whether that is possible, since NIH funding is very limited.
That's amazing. I mean, there's pharma, I think, also has their difficulties with clinical trials. Just in the last 2 years, we've seen some of the mesothelioma trials close due to low accrual. I mean, even when we query like our internal like data set, we're lucky that we connect with so many mesothelioma patients through our advocacy organization. And we've seen even from 2023 to 2025, a decrease from about 14% of patients who had been enrolled in clinical trials for treatments down to about 8%. Is this a trend that we're seeing around the nation? Is this specific just to rare cancers? What do you think is happening?
I think that there can be many things that play into this. One of the things can be a decreased enthusiasm of the patients, now talking about mesothelioma, into the clinical trials. Because if the short-term response of the clinical trials is not favorable, then people lose enthusiasm to be enrolled into a clinical trial. In general, people who are enrolled in clinical trials do better than people who are not enrolled in clinical trials because they have a level of support around them that the others do not have. So clinical trials improve the quality of care to patients. But I think that it has to do with did it work before? It's not working well. I don't want to do that. Side effects that can be very painful, and patients who think that it's not worth it to go through the side effects, and could also be cost. I mean, when you talk about closing clinical trials, if it are NIH-funded clinical trials, I understand that they end up being closed because there is not much money. If pharma is the last one that has money, hospitals and universities are struggling. So while before they were able to support research that was done in their institutions, today is more difficult for them because for every $1 million in grants that I get from the NIH pays 60% on top of it to my university. That is $600,000. So that is what is called indirect cost. The moment that there are less grants that go out, there is going to be less indirect cost, which means the university will have less funds available to dedicate to research because they are also suffering from it. So it becomes a cycle.
I understand. I think, when I think about the patients that I've interacted with when it comes to clinical trial, they bring up a lot of different issues like distance from where clinical trial can be done, the amount of times that they have to go. The burden of traveling is a huge one. There's also this, like you were saying, like, is there hope in that clinical trial? I mean, we try our hardest to every patient that we speak to tell them about the clinical trials available, but it's definitely you've piqued my interest with these intramural NIH clinical trials where patients can get access to cutting edge research and completely get free of costs. These are amazing. Can they only do patients have to travel all the way to the NIH to get these done, or can they do them at their home institutions? Do you know what the burdens would be for that kind of trial?
Well, they have to travel, but it's paid. The travel is paid. The hotel is paid. Everything is paid by the NIH. So it's really a phenomenal thing that the NIH offers. I mean, I'm very enthusiastic about the NIH, but think about it. I mean, all the expenses are covered. But yes, you have to travel to the NIH because all the team is at the NIH. But it's an outstanding team of physicians that takes care of you in one of the best places in the world. Of course, if you headed down the road, it would be easier, but you can't have the NIH next to you.
Maybe that's something we can recommend.
Yes.
This is amazing. Thank you so much. I always think about what can we do from here, right? We wish that there would be more cancer research funding. As us advocates, patients, their families, what can they do to try to continue that interest towards research?
I hope that organizations like yours can help, on one end, to help convince our legislatures that they are not immune from cancer. We all hope that they will not get cancer, but unfortunately they will. And in fact, every day we read, not every day, but every year, several of them die of cancer. And so that it would be a good idea that they put more funding into cancer because cancer research has saved a lot of lives. Think, for example, melanoma I mentioned before. Before, when you had metastatic melanoma, you had to write a will because you were dead within 3 months. Today, 50% of people survive metastatic melanoma. I had visiting a friend of mine, Al Brayton, who is an asbestos lawyer. And a few years ago, he called me because he had been diagnosed with metastatic melanoma. I said, don't worry, You're going to get treated and you'll do well. And he did it great. Now it's been 10 years. He's great. Thanks to what? Thanks to cancer research. Without cancer research, Al would be dead. Would have been dead within a few weeks. Instead, cancer research saved his life. And there are many Al around. So we can, but that is cancer research. If you do not put money into cancer research, those things don't happen. So that your organization can do. Help. Lobbying is called, I think. I can't believe that you have to lobby something for such a logical thing, but you have to lobby these people so that they and their families don't die of cancer. The next thing is, for mesothelioma in particular, it's really incredible to think that millions, billions of dollars are moved by litigation, and none of that goes into cancer research. Especially now that in the immediate future, there is no real funding from the feds coming for cancer research. With all this money, the $1 billion that the Johnson & Johnson is giving, it's incredible, but there is so much money that moves in litigation. Is it possible that the companies, the asbestos lawyers who make a tremendous amount of money cannot get together and create a fund to support mesothelioma research? I mean, please, okay?
I agree with you that the increased advocacy for increased research funding is definitely something that is near and dear to us here as well. I mean, we advocate for patients at the forefront when they get diagnosed, but we try to definitely incorporate all avenues of advocacy, and going to Capitol Hill in order to try to get people to increase the funding was one of our big pushes this last year. And so when they 2 weeks ago published that they were fully funding the NIH, even though it is still insufficient for what is needed, we were pretty ecstatic at the prospects, and hopefully the following years will improve from there, and we won't stop. So Dr. Carbone, I just sincerely want to thank you for joining us today, and for, as we talked about, the decades that you've dedicated to understanding mesothelioma and the patients who develop this awful cancer mostly. Today's conversation really highlights that progresses in rare cancer do not happen by accident. They require sustained funding, scientific rigor, collaboration. I think now more than ever, diversifying that collaboration and patients who are willing to participate in these trials. So for our listeners, I just want to say, whether you're a patient, family member, clinician, advocate, research is not an abstract concept. It's a reason for the treatments to continue evolving. It's the reason that the survival has improved. It's the reason that we continue to have hope for this cancer. So, Dr. Carbone, thank you for your commitment to this community, and thank you for having joined us today for this very important topic.
Catherine, thank you very much for inviting me. Ciao.
Ciao.
Have you or a loved one been exposed to asbestos? You may have legal options. Contact the Mesothelioma Center at asbestos.com or call 833-628-8546 to reach one of our patient advocates today.